Welcome, everybody. Welcome to London Futurists. My name is David Wood. In a minute, I'll hand over to our speaker today, Dr. Aubrey de Grey of the Sense Research Foundation. But first, whilst some of the audience are still, as it were, finding their way into their virtual seats, let me offer a few short words of context. What changes the world? Sometimes an individual person can rise above history and change the world. Consider Napoleon, Margaret Thatcher, Isaac Newton, Marie Curie, Martin Luther King, Catherine the Great, Mikhail Gorbachev. Sometimes it's an invention that changes the world. The printing press, the steam engine, the Haber-Bosch process to synthesize ammonia and transform agriculture, the Gatling machine gun, the nuclear bomb, the computer. Sometimes it's an idea at the right time, which changes the world. Liberté, égalité, fraternity. Salvation by faith alone. Evolution by natural selection. The germ theory of infectious diseases. And sometimes it's an anticipation which can change the world. An anticipation of an idea, an anticipation of an invention, an anticipation of radically improved circumstances in the lives of individuals all over the world. At London Futurists today, we're going to be hearing about how a growing anticipation could change the world more quickly than is generally expected. It's an anticipation that ideas championed by our speaker today will in due course actually work. That growing anticipation can change the world even before sense-style rejuvenation therapies are widely and fully available. That growing anticipation could be transformational. It could also be a profound dislocation. Should we fear that dislocation or welcome it? Can we steer its course? Should we try to accelerate it? Over to you, Aubrey de Grey.
Thanks, David. And I guess I should probably begin by saying that I'm probably not going to be at my most eloquent today because I'm extremely short of sleep, as are my heroic team, who between us have been working around the clock, literally, to do our part of an extraordinary event that is in progress right now, and which I will come back to in a minute. I really, I'm grateful to you, David, for specifically choosing this topic for me to discuss right now. The topic of a potential change in what people expect the future to look like. Because this is something that I've been saying increasingly loudly over the past couple of years, but it seems that I should be saying it even more loudly awfully soon, because we may be at the beginning of it right now. The thing in question is that, as you alluded to a moment ago, the therapies that will bring aging under comprehensive medical control are definitely not here yet, and in fact I believe that we have maybe a 50% chance of those therapies arriving within about 15 years from now, which is not exactly tomorrow either. So, a lot of people have the attitude that they'll believe it when they see it. And of course, that attitude is extremely justified by history, by the fact that we have, since the beginning of civilization, not only known that aging is the world's worst problem, even though some of us choose not to admit it, but also we have known that we can't do anything about it, except that people keep coming along saying, yes, we can. And they've always been wrong. So, of course, when the next person comes along and says that, there is absolutely plenty of reason for skepticism. But in this highly connected, globalized world that we live in, with information being shared so rapidly across the whole world, there is the opportunity, this time around, to see what's coming before it comes. In other words, to monitor progress and expert opinion about progress, as steps are taken in the direction of what will eventually be a post-aging world. So this brings me actually, I mean, perhaps I should, parenthetically go back and say something about why some people choose not to admit that aging is the world's worst problem. In fact, it's not some people, of course, it's almost everybody actually tries to pretend that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise, or at very least that it is something woven so inextricably into the fabric of the universe that there's never anything that we could even potentially do about it with medicine. That it's just inevitable and universal and natural and get over it kind of thing. I believe that both that attitude and the attitude that aging is a blessing in disguise, which of course manifests itself in all manner of different ways, some people would say that the whole of religion is part of that, both of those things come down ultimately to psychology. They come down to the inability that people have to simply cope with the horror of what's going to happen to them, at least probably, in the relatively distant future. And so they have to find some way to put it out of their minds and get on with their miserably short lives and, make the best of it, rather than this preoccupation. Now, until I came along 20 years ago, that was the rational thing to do. It made sense, because let's face it, what are you going to achieve by being preoccupied by this thing? But for the past 20 years, there has been a plan. And in fact, for the past 10 years, that plan has been quite mainstream among the expert community. I basically won the intellectual battle, so to speak, over a relative. 10 years isn't bad, actually, for introducing and selling an entire new paradigm to one's field. So that's all fine. But yes, for those 10 years, even though there has been mainstream agreement that we have a way forward that can bring aging under medical control, albeit there is a spectrum of opinion about how rapidly and how comprehensively, still the contention that it isn't going to happen or that it shouldn't happen is virtually ubiquitous. Now, there's going to be a point where that changes. There's going to be a point where people start to see that aging is really within striking distance of coming to an end, and the logic, even the psychological logic of not getting one's hopes up, just will not be sustainable anymore. And I think about that quite a lot. The reason I think about it quite a lot is because I believe that it's going to happen really soon. In fact, I think in particular that it's likely to happen at least a decade prior to the arrival of the therapies themselves. And that's wonderful in some ways, and it's a problem in other ways. So I'm going to try and spend a few minutes explaining the details of my thinking in that regard. I'm a thought leader in the biology of aging, and I've been out there saying we're going to bring aging under medical control, and I've been saying it for quite a long time now, nearly 20 years really, since I started doing high-profile media and talks and so on. But I am just one thought leader in this field. Now, there's plenty of others. But actually, let me correct that. There aren't really plenty of others. There's probably no more than half a dozen people who, first of all, are acknowledged authorities in this space, and secondly, actually spend time doing interface with the wider world, doing a lot of media and such like. And the thing is, we're all good friends. We all know each other well, we all know each other's views really well, which means that we also know what it's going to take to change each other's views, and for that matter, to change each other's publicly stated views. A huge part of the reason why I created Sense Research Foundation as a non-profit, and indeed Methuselah Foundation before that, an independent non-profit funded pretty much entirely by philanthropy, is because I wanted to be able to tell it like it is. My colleagues have not been so fortunate. Even those who are as courageous as me, so to speak. They have not been so fortunate because they have had to worry either about the short-termism of their shareholders or else about getting their next grant application funded or getting promoted or getting tenure or whatever, which is also a huge short-termism problem in its own way because essentially you've got to publish every 10 minutes in order to get that to happen. So my colleagues have been forced to be extremely curmudgeonly when it comes to what they say and how they say it. And the example, probably the most conspicuous example of recent times that I like to mention is David Sinclair, my good friend who has the misfortune to be a professor at Harvard and who wrote a book 2 years ago whose title was Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. In contrast to the book I wrote, Ending Aging, which I wrote 14 years ago. Now, is that because he's more of a coward than me? Oh no, it certainly is not. It's because he couldn't have written a book with that title 14 years ago and kept his job. Simple as that. Whereas now we've made enough progress in the direction of bringing aging under medical control that it is safe to say things you couldn't previously say. Still, people don't say the kind of things that I say. They don't like to run away very fast when we talk about time frames, and indeed when we talk about the magnitude of the postponement of age-related health problems, which, of course, for me, revolves around the concept of longevity escape velocity. But who cares? The fact is that even if the center of gravity of publicly stated expert opinion shifts only to the point of saying, yes, we may, within the lifetime of many people alive today, achieve 20 or 30 years of extension of healthy life, and therefore, as a side effect, extension of total life. Even if that's all, quote, that they say, that would be perfectly good enough. It would be perfectly good enough to change attitudes around the world, not just in terms of the general public, but in terms of policymakers and decision makers, absolutely profoundly. Now, for the past 18 months, we have, of course, had a new component to this whole landscape, and inevitably I'm talking about COVID. COVID has shown us a lot about the importance of the elderly and the magnitude of the tragedy that is biological aging. We have not only been made aware of the human suffering associated with aging, which we kind of were sweeping under the carpet, we have also been made aware of the absolutely astronomical economic cost of human aging. And right now, as the minds of policymakers and decision makers around the world are being allowed to shift away from the imperative of bringing the current pandemic to an end, they will be shifting in the direction of minimizing the likelihood and the magnitude of the next pandemic. And it is not going to be possible to think about that for very long without understanding that aging is the problem here and that there is the potential to make a big dent in that likelihood and that severity of the next pandemic by medical interventions that are very, very close, that are already in clinical trials or about to be. I'm talking here mostly about rejuvenation of the elderly immune system, which of course is the most direct aspect of aging in relation to resistance to infections. However, I'm of course not only talking about that, because like any system in the body, the immune system is not an island. It is a system that interacts and has crosstalk with everything else in the body. So we will only have really thorough, really dramatic rejuvenation of the elderly immune system by rejuvenating everything else at the same time. And that certainly is something that needs to happen. I am at the moment in increasingly intensive discussions with, not with heads of state, unfortunately, but with people that heads of state listen to, which is not so bad. And with a bit of luck, the message will get through in time before people get distracted by the next distraction. So yes, so we could be quite close to taking aging more seriously, much more seriously. But this brings me back to the general public, because, I used to call it the triangular logjam between scientists and politicians and the general public. That essentially scientists have to become urgently in order to pacify their paymasters in the government, and the government has to become urgently in order to get re-elected. And this, of course, means that the public only hear what the scientists want to say, and they continue to become urgently too. That is something that I tried to unlock with the creation of Methuselah and Sense, and it's beginning to be unlocked. So the public, yes. I believe that at the end of the day, we do have no choice other than to bring about a shift in public opinion if we really want this done properly. Because what I just said about politicians is not going to change. Politicians do only really have one thing on their minds, which is to get re-elected. And therefore, it's not just me anymore getting out there doing an interview every 10 minutes and a talk every 20 minutes. One of the most important things that's happened over the past few years is the emergence of true diversity of messaging, of other extremely articulate people going out there and giving the same kind of message, but in a different voice with different forms of words. I often highlight Liz Parrish in this regard, also Keith Comito, various other people. I believe that I'm very good at what I do, but I only do what I do. There are people with whom my message resonates, and there are people with whom my particular way of describing this message does not resonate. So diversity of messaging is another huge piece of progress that's been made. But then, I really want to say, the public is not an amorphous, uniform mass. There are early adopters, the biohackers, that are out there doing this or that. Of course, Liz Parrish normally gets spoken about in that capacity. But there are also early adopters in terms of advocacy. And when I say advocacy, I mean it in many ways. I mean it in the form of saying the right things, doing podcasts, whatever. I also mean it in terms of doing the right things, whether it's going into the most impactful areas of research, whether it's writing the biggest check you possibly can. Of course, most people can't write particularly big checks, but I always point out that the poorer you are, the larger the number of people you will know who are wealthier than you. So that, of course, brings us back to advocacy. But this brings us to the topic that's on my mind right now, and that is the source of my and my colleagues' lack of sleep, which is the airdrop. So one thing that has been extremely clear over the past 15 years is that there are certain subsets of the general public who are just a lot more receptive than others than average to the message of bringing aging under medical control. One of those groups is libertarians. Well, duh, that's no real surprise. Libertarians are comfortable with thinking out of the box and with radical new ideas that may transform the world. The second group is IT people. Well, I used to be an IT person. I did my first degree in computer science. Maybe that's not surprising either. Maybe the reason why the damage repair approach for rejuvenation was something that I brought forward rather than something that any career biologist thought of, is because it falls out of that way of thinking. And maybe that's why this is so easy to sell to the people who think like me. The third group is Canadians, and I have no explanation for that at all, but certainly Canadians have been insanely overrepresented in the longevity community since the very beginning. However, today the topic is crypto mavens, people who are into cryptocurrencies and blockchain and all that kind of thing. That community has also, ever since it emerged a few years ago, been an enormous source of support for us. I have over and over again been invited to cryptocurrency events, conferences, in which I am the only speaker who isn't doing a hardcore crypto talk, and I'm only there because the organizers are fans. And so half the audience, they just, they want to hear what's new. So, what is going on now? Well, what's going on now is that the support in terms of actual money from the crypto community is exploding. This all began pretty early on, actually, in the history of crypto. Many of you out here will know that the guy who created Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, started to donate substantially to Sense Research Foundation as soon as he got into a position of being able to. That's no real surprise because he read my book when he was 14, and so he is one of what I like to call these days the children of the revolution, someone of a generation who has never had to change their mind about the medical amenability of aging, simply because they were never brainwashed in the first place into the view that aging is inevitable and natural and universal. Age matters here a lot, and of course a very large majority of the crypto community are of that kind of generation. They're in their 20s. But yes, so substantial money. And then he's not the only one. About 3.5 years ago, many of you will remember that there was a huge, albeit brief, spike in crypto value. And, well, it wasn't all that brief, it only subsided by a factor of 2 or so. When that happened, we received $6.5 million of actual fiat currency in a period of about 3 weeks, largely from 4 7-digit donations. Honestly, it was breathtaking, but looking back, it wasn't surprising given the level of enthusiasm that was already being articulated verbally by the crypto community. And we've certainly benefited from that. The research has benefited from that. Over the past 3.5 years, we have got considerably more done than we otherwise would have. But right now, we're in the middle of another crypto boom. And sure enough, over the past 9 months or so, that has translated into a very healthy income for Sense Research Foundation, which is already translating into the initiation of new projects and the growth of the projects that we already had. Extremely happy about all of that. But then there's Richard Hart. So, as you will all know, there are lots of cryptocurrencies. The largest one by market cap is obviously Bitcoin. The second one is Ethereum. But there are hundreds, there may be thousands for all I know. One of the top 10 in market cap is a currency called Hex, which is quite an interesting one, apparently a somewhat polarizing one. A number of people have apparently expressed reservations about Hex and about how it's being done. But I kind of don't care, and the reason I don't care is because it was created by a guy named Richard Hart, that's H-E-A-R-T, who is a supporter of ours. In fact, he's been a supporter for a long time. He was a volunteer at one of my conferences in Cambridge, UK, back in the mid-2000s, And of course, back then he had no money, but he knew how to video things, and so he did some of the videoing for our conferences, one or two of them. Since then, I haven't heard anything from him. In fact, I hadn't heard of Hex until about a month ago. But now I have, because Richard got in touch, and the reason he got in touch was because he had decided to support Sense financially, in, however, a rather interesting way. So we have had very substantial seven-digit donations from various people in the crypto world and outside it over the past while, and that's great. But Richard decided he wasn't going to give us money himself. Rather, he was going to encourage other people to give us money. And Richard, as far as I can now tell, is more or less the Oprah Winfrey of the crypto world. He has a band of followers. Apparently they sometimes call themselves hexagons. A very large band, and indeed a very devoted band. So when he says, do this, they do. And the this that he has asked them to do is to donate money to Sense Research Foundation. Now, what he's done here is he's created a new currency, a new type of cryptocurrency. It's going to be called Pulse Chain, and it's going to launch very soon. There is, however, right now, a 2-week period in progress, started 2 days ago, which is a kind of pre-launch phase. And during that phase, Richard has encouraged everybody, whether or not they hold Hex, to donate to Sense Research Foundation. It's rather convenient that actually you can't donate Hex to Sense Research Foundation. You can only donate the cryptocurrencies that are traded by Coinbase, of which there are only about 70. You can also donate anything else you like. You can donate US dollars, any other fiat currency, you can donate stock, you can do anything like that. But in terms of cryptocurrencies, that's the limitation. And people are doing so. What are they getting for it? They're not getting anything as an actual benefit for donation. That would actually not be allowed. There could be no actual contractual, undertaking, because it wouldn't make it a charitable tax-deductible contribution anymore. But Richard is free, as an independent individual, to do what he likes with the information that he requests from us concerning who gave how much money and when. And if he wants to reward people voluntarily, then he can, and it doesn't have any tax implications. And that's what he has said he is likely to do. So this is the main reason why a lot of people are giving us money. Yesterday, somebody gave us $10 million. Just one person gave us $10 million. And I don't know who it is. He wrote to us under a pseudonym. I shouldn't even say he, really, because I don't actually know whether it's a he. But this person said that they had been following me and the work that we do for a very long time, for well over a decade. And when they started following this work, they were dirt poor, and now they are rich beyond their wildest dreams. And they've been saying to themselves for years, let's make a little more money before doing anything. And the airdrop, as Richard Hart has called it, this business, was the thing that tipped this person over the edge into making a dramatic donation. Somebody else has given us 3 million. Somebody else has given us more than 1 million. A couple of other people have given us more than 1 million. Lots of people have given us 6-digit money over the past 48 hours. And it's still coming in. We're getting multiple emails per minute. That is literally the case. I have no idea how long it's going to take me to get control of my inbox again. Of course, I'm not doing this on my own. I want to repeat that my absolutely heroic team are, makes me cry, honestly. They're killing it. They're doing fantastic work. And, it's going to make a difference. It's going to make a huge difference. One thing that all of you will know is that over the past 5 years, there's been a huge explosion of interest in longevity in the private sector, with startups coming out of everywhere, hundreds and hundreds of them. We at Sense Research Foundation spun out half a dozen of them, and you know, it's enormous because investors tend to write bigger checks than donors do. So this has meant that a lot of really critical work has been funded much more effectively than it was being funded prior to that, especially when it had to rely only on philanthropic support from us. So that's all wonderful, but it is unevenly distributed. Some, inevitably, of the many technologies that we will need to develop in order to bring aging under proper medical control, some of them are harder to develop than others. And therefore, some of them are already in clinical trials and definitely being pursued aggressively by the private sector with the financial help of very numerous investors. But some of them are not yet in clinical trials, and some of them may be quite some way away from clinical trials. So this means that Sense Research Foundation, as a non-profit, is not in any danger of shutting up shop and declaring victory anytime soon. We still have lots to do. And that, of course, is something that we are going to be able to do a lot more effectively as a result of what's happening right now with this airdrop of the money that's come in. To put this in proportion for those of you who don't know, so the amount of money that's come in over the past 48 hours is somewhere around $20 million. Our annual budget over a typical year in the past 5 years or so has been between $4 and $5 million. Of course, it fluctuates, and this year it was already looking pretty good. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we've had, ever since the crypto boom, the new crypto boom began, we've had quite healthy income, but nothing like this. So perhaps I should spend a little while talking about what I'm currently thinking in terms of how this money is going to be spent. There are some individual projects which are just really hard and are not likely to be picked up by the private sector anytime soon. One project that's well known to most people who've been following our work for a long time is our Mitochondrial Mutations project, where we seek to make backup copies of the mitochondrial DNA placed into the nucleus. That project has done really well recently. I just want to highlight one of our researchers, Bhavna Dixit, who led some work that has resulted in a massive breakthrough a few months ago in getting that to work, but I won't go into the technical details because that would take me half an hour. The rest of what I'm thinking, though, is a little more, a little off the beaten track of individual projects. First thing I want to talk about is education. So I've been saying for a long time that our education program is probably the single most underfunded aspect of what we do at Sense Research Foundation. About 9 years ago, I think, we recruited well, actually, let me tell the story starting about 11 years ago instead. 11 years ago, a highly enterprising young lady named Sarah Fazal wrote to us out of the blue and said, "Hello, I'm about to start a master's at New York University at NYU. In the meantime, I have a couple of months to spare. I would like to do an internship with you, please. I don't need to be paid. My family can support me for this." And we said, no, we haven't a clue how to make this happen. So thank you very much for the thought, but sorry. And then the following year, she did it again. She wrote back saying, right, I've done my first year of my master's. I've got another year to come. I've got a few months. And so we thought, well, we can't make her go away again. So we let her volunteer in the lab. And she was blazingly good. And so we thought, well, wow, we've got to make a thing out of this. So 9 years ago, we hired a fantastic guy named Greg Chin, who had had a pretty normal academic career for most of his. I mean, he'd gone through up to postdoctoral level, and he'd done a bit in education at Stanford. So we hired him, and he created our education program. And It has been the most extraordinary success. Over the next few years, he built it up and built it up. We like to say that it's harder to get into our education program than it is to get into MIT, because actually it's true in the statistical sense. We only take 2 or 3% of our applicants. But of course, the reason we only take that few is because we only have enough money for that few, which is a shame. So one thing I want to talk about, and I wish I were able to talk about the details of this, but unfortunately the contracts are not signed yet, so I can't quite talk about it in absolute detail. But I will say that we are very nearly certain to be about to launch an extremely substantial expansion of the education program at a second prestigious institution. And of course, this will mean more students being trained. It will mean more labs benefiting from the quality of these students. You know, normally you'd expect that someone comes into a lab for like 3 months. You know, basically you just spend those months training them, and they contribute nothing. That's not our students. Our students take about 3 days to be trained, and they have regularly contributed sufficiently in the lab to actually get authorship on peer-reviewed published papers thereafter from the labs in question. We also have, just before I forget, I mustn't forget this, we also have, over the past 4 years, if I'm not mistaken, been running in parallel with the Summer Scholars Programme, a programme for what we call post-baccalaureate. So what that means, in less flowery language, is that when you have just obtained your bachelor's degree, you can come into our lab or into one of the labs we work with, not for 3 months, but for an entire year. And of course, you can get that much more done that way. And that program too is completely amazing. It's like we get the most extraordinary people coming out. A lot of these people end up doing big things elsewhere. We've got ex-summer scholars running companies in the longevity space now. We've got them founding venture funds. We've got a lot of people doing stuff in the longevity space, having gone through our group, and I'm insanely proud of that, and therefore I'm, of course, insanely happy that we are about to launch this very substantial expansion of the effort. And certainly the more money we have, the more we'll do that expanding, because we need a lot more youngsters. Of two types, let me say. We need youngsters who are already really talented biologists to move into geroscience, to actually study the biology of aging and contribute to it. That may not necessarily be something that they would do if they didn't have a bit of exposure to it firsthand. So a lot of what we do is that. The other component, the other constituency of youngsters that we are looking for, of course, is longevity crusaders, people who absolutely, totally want to contribute to the longevity crusade, but who are not yet as good a biologists as they could be. They better be damn good already, or they won't get into the program, but we want to make them even better. And we do. So yes, those are the kinds of the two archetypes of the students we're looking for. Same applies to the labs we work with, for that matter. We choose labs that are doing work that we believe is worth doing, and some of the most prestigious labs in the world are parts of this. So yeah, that's one. The other main theme that I want to highlight before I let people ask questions is combining of therapies. So it's well known to, I guess, everybody here that the approach that we pursue at Sense Research Foundation, the approach that I put forward 20 years ago, is a damage repair approach, where we try to eliminate the molecular and cellular changes that the body does to itself throughout life, and that eventually exceed what the body is set up to tolerate, so making us sick. And that because the body is extraordinarily complicated, it creates many, many types of damage, which I like to classify into 7 broad categories, which are aligned with 7 generic approaches to doing the damage repair. And that's all very well, and as I say, the pursuit of those things is going really nicely. But one thing that is going to be necessary at the end of this very clear divide and conquer approach is to do the opposite of dividing. In other words, to put these therapies together in the same people at the same time. And inevitably, there is going to be that's going to be a period of surprises. Some of the surprises may be, unfortunate. We may find that there are unwarranted, unanticipated interactions between these things. When I make my time frame estimates, I throw in a few years just for that phase. So, why am I mentioning this in such expansive terms? Simply because combining things is not easily aligned with private sector incentive structures. The private sector works on the basis of intellectual property and patents and so on, and they have the patents they have, and they don't have the patents they don't have. And of course, there are ways around this for collaborations when collaboration makes sense, licensing and so on, but it takes time to sort those things out. So we are already perceiving, I'm perceiving anyway, that the private sector is probably not going to pick up that ball as quickly as it needs to. For that reason, we have at Sense Research Foundation for the past 6 or 8 months been launching the first step of an attempt to address this potential bottleneck. We've started doing a mouse experiment where the mice are given mesenchymal stem cells and also a senolytic, a drug that eliminates senescent cells. And the goal is to see whether we obviously get life extension. The reason why those two things were chosen was because they have been reported individually to achieve life extension when initiated in middle age, when the mice are already in middle age, very important part. So, we want to know whether we can get more than the sum of the parts. And in particular, we also, as I say, we want to know whether these things somehow antagonize each other, whether there's a problem that we come across. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that we're going to need to do quite a lot more of this kind of experiment, and that, I believe, is going to be one of the best uses of this massively elevated budget that we are now going to be able to allocate. All right, so David, I think I'll stop there. I think I've probably rambled on enough, and I'm happy to chat and answer questions and everything.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. It was lots of news, actually, things that I didn't know myself, and I'm sure many of the audience didn't know that well either. So let's talk a little bit more about timescales, if we may. So you said that you've actually got various models in mind when you do these timescale estimates. So what gives you some confidence that we might reach the therapies being available within 15 years, say? And what gives you the possibility that there might be a big mood swing in the public in as little as 5 years?
Well, first thing I want to say is in relation to the end of your question, I'm beginning to think it's going to be about 5 days before that happens, because the mainstream media haven't picked up on this airdrop yet, but they will. It's very conspicuous. But yeah, so how do I do my time frame estimates? Well, first of all, I've never denied this is very subjective. I don't have a spreadsheet. I don't have quantitative metrics really. But the first thing that means is that when I give an estimate, it's a 50-50% chance estimate. So I always point out that there's at least a 10% chance, in my view, that we won't get to longevity escape velocity for 100 years. I also point out that that's fine, in the sense that a 50% chance is quite enough to be worth fighting for. But how do I get there? Well, of course, what I do is I look at the individual components of the sense plan. I ask, where are we at with those things? How rapidly are we progressing? How rapidly are we likely to progress? How likely is it that there will be an additional type of damage that I've overlooked that we need to address with some radically different damage repair approach? Things like that. And as time has gone on, the situation is improving that way. So when I started out talking about sense in the year 2000, it had been 18 years since anybody had discovered any fundamentally new type of damage that accumulates in the human body during aging. And that seemed like quite a long time to find nothing out, so I drew confidence from that. But that was somewhat fragile as an argument, because the fact is people hadn't been looking for types of damage in the same way that I was, and that is now traditional and mainstream. But now, we're 20 years later, and it's still the case that nothing new has been found since 1982. Of course, plenty of new examples that fit naturally within the categories have been found, but no new category. That's a big thing. Second big thing is about money. So when I first started talking about timeframes, that would have been about 2004, maybe 2003, I said that I thought we'd get to longevity escape velocity with 50% probability in 25 years. And that's 18 years ago. So obviously things have slipped. But there are two things to say about that that are really important. First thing is that almost all the slippage happened in the first 9 of those 18 years. Hardly any has happened in the second 9. So, that's good news. The second thing is we can look back and ask what was the cause of the slippage. In other words, what aspect of the problem of the time frame was I over-optimistic about? And the answer is the funding. In 2003, we had basically no money, but I felt fairly optimistic that we could get it. And sure enough, in 2006, I was able to persuade Peter Thiel to start giving us $1 million a year. At that point, I thought my fundraising work is done. The other billionaires are going to be lining up. And I was wrong. I was completely wrong. It took another 4 years before anyone started writing us order of $1 million a year checks. And then another 6 years before the next one. But that's all over now. We've got a very large number of, well, not large, but a very substantial number of wealthy people writing us really big checks. And we've got a very substantial increase in the number of grassroots funders. We get a substantial proportion of our income from small donations. So anyone out there who may be thinking, well, these billionaires are doing the job for me, please don't think that. So that's good, because as I say, the days when money is the rate limiter seem to be coming to an end. The other component that I put in is the one I mentioned earlier, the extra time I have for combining things and getting the bugs out of what we see when we do. But actually, I should also say one thing about this, because this is something I sometimes don't remember to say. Some people are thinking, well, I'm talking about the time frame for development of these therapies, and it'll be God knows how long after that before they become widely available. When they're available to people other than the wealthy. So this is, again, of course, a huge aspect of anticipating the anticipation, of the fact that people are going to know that these therapies are coming well before they arrive. I personally believe that it is pretty much a done deal that decision makers and policy makers around the world will do the right thing during that interval of anticipation. In other words, they will, invest, front load on infrastructure and training of medical personnel and everything, so that in fact everyone will get these therapies who's old enough to need them almost instantly after anyone can get them, because they've just been developed. And I do not say that out of some kind of utopian optimism. I say that because you don't need to buy the humanitarian imperative if you're a head of state to do this. You don't even need to buy the electoral imperative that it's going to be impossible to get re-elected unless you do this. You can just buy the economic imperative, the fact that aging is so unbelievably expensive, and therefore these therapies will pay for themselves many, many times over very, very fast, even when the therapies themselves are new and therefore expensive to administer. So that doesn't come into my timeframe estimates because it doesn't need to.
Great. A quick comment to the audience. We're going to take questions from the Q&A window largely, and because there are already lots of good questions. We probably won't be able to cover them all, so help me pick the ones by voting for them, and we'll take them there. A very quick one from the chat window first, Aubrey. Callum Chase is looking for confirmation whether the airdrop is confidential, or can journalists and bloggers already talk about it?
The airdrop is the least confidential thing you've ever seen. The more people talk about it, the sooner they talk about it, the better. I actually distributed information about it just last night to half a dozen journalists in this space. Callum, I apologise for forgetting you, but the news stories are beginning to go live now. There's one on lifespan.io already, I think. And yeah, we want to get this out there, way outside the longevity community today. We want mainstream media talking about this today.
So get cracking, everybody. Share the news. I also saw the lifespan.io one. Let's take a question from Mathieu Miosek. Do you anticipate any strong backlash from sections of the public, given that people can realize this stuff might be more real more soon? Do you worry that it might seriously impede research?
No, I don't. I understand where the question is coming from, though, and people are asking me that quite regularly at the moment because, of course, we are seeing a distinctly disconcerting spectrum of opinion about COVID vaccines. It is scary. But this is another part of what I'm talking about in relation to anticipation. I think that it's only going to take a little while for people who think and talk in that kind of way to just, be educated into a more rational perspective, and that will all be well over by the time this all arrives. In terms of impeding research, well, you have to remember that you don't have to persuade everybody that the research is worthwhile in order to get the research to happen. I was mentioning earlier that money is probably pretty much becoming non-rate limiting for the speed of research already, even way before we have this change.
But you're not asking for a slowdown in the money, because you can apply it, as you said, very interestingly, to the education project in a way that can scale up indefinitely.
That's right. I mean, I normally think in fairly conservative terms financially because I'm focused on the early stage research. So we all know that phase 3 clinical trials cost a very great deal of money, but that money is easy to get once you get to phase 3 because the technology in question has been so heavily de-risked and people are willing to write big checks. It's the early stage that has been struggling. Yeah. So basically, I used to say that we could probably go 3 times faster if we had just one more digit on our budget at SANS. Now I would say that factor is down to below 2, but it's definitely not 1.
A couple of questions about mice. And one reason I picked this is I remember vividly a conference which you and I participated in 2014 called Anticipating 2025. And in that conference, you said that what might happen by 2025 is that there would be a wide public appreciation that therapies had extended the lives of mice, and therefore it would only be a matter of time before therapies could extend the lives of humans. So this is a question from Didier Cornell, who says that some time ago, you once said that mice will live far longer than the normal maximal lifespan, and when that happens, people will change their minds. So should we be prioritizing this? Because it seems that longer aged mice, and they live longer on average, but the actual maximum hasn't improved much in the last 5 years or so.
So we started the Methuselah Mouse Prizes for, as Didier says, world record mouse lifespan back in 2003. And the structure of the prizes was arranged so that basically you would get some proportion of the money that had come into us, the prize pot, depending on how much you beat the previous record by. So, of course, there had to be a previous record in it to kick the thing off, and that record was never broken during the well, in fact, it's still not been broken. But the rhetorical power, the rhetorical impact of this was very effective. We judged that it was a great way to raise the profile of longevity research. It certainly did so. And indeed, the money that came in was sufficient to allow us to start doing our own research, starting probably in 2005. And which of course led eventually to the creation of Sense Research Foundation. So yeah, I'm kind of in two minds about whether to go back to that. Because it may have kind of done its job already, in the sense that we know that mice are not people. In other words, that when something does work really well in mice, we've still got to get it working in humans as well. And the amount of effort and money that's going into this now is beginning, well, I would say it has, in some aspects anyway, reached the point where we can simply rush all the way to clinical trials and thereby sidestep the risk of being misled by non-human aspects of mouse physiology. So, yeah, I'm kind of in two minds about that one.
Okay, let's just follow up very quickly. You mentioned...
Let me actually, because I see that Didier has also written something else which I'd like to comment on. He said, "Hello, Aubrey. Canadians are into healthy longevity, great, but not French-speaking Canadians, I think, from Quebec." Well, actually, you're dead wrong. So I mentioned the research that we started funding back in 2005. We funded a few PhD students. One of them was Jacques Mathieu, who was indeed, as you can tell from the name, a French-Canadian. Definitely bilingual, you wouldn't know he was French just to listen to him over the telephone, but yeah, definitely from Quebec. And he did fantastic work. He was actually his research was the first big breakthrough that we made when we found a bacterial enzyme that could digest oxidized cholesterol. That was published in, I think, 2012. Fast forward, there's a professor at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York named Jean Hébert, who is funded by us to do a very ambitious project and who is about as immortalist as you can be if you're also a professor. So yeah, he of course again is very much from Quebec. So by no means is Quebec less fervent than the rest of Canada.
Jean Hébert's project is about stimulating or somehow introducing extra brain cells. So it's repairing organs.
We have basically funded almost no stem cell research in the past decade that we've been running. And the reason we haven't is because it's so well funded by other people. And it's one thing where our work would be a drop in the ocean. But Jean's project is an exception to this because it is all about doing something that sounds so hard that nobody else would. Specifically, stem cell therapy for Alzheimer's disease. We know that Alzheimer's disease is a very multifactorial phenomenon. People can get rid of amyloid plaques now and it basically doesn't help. Not because amyloid plaques don't matter, they probably do matter in my view, but simply because other things matter as well and therefore you're not seeing much benefit. So yes, of course, in Alzheimer's disease, certainly in more advanced stages of it, neurons die all over the brain. And this is not good. The brain, this is a large part of why the brain stops working. So we really want to fix that, and stem cell therapy is obviously the way to go. The difficulty is because these cells are all over the brain, we can't do the same thing that we do in Parkinson's disease in clinical trials that are already underway, which is to inject the cells into the place where they are needed. In Parkinson's disease, there's just one tiny place called the substantia nigra where we need to put these cells. Sometimes it's all over. Why is that a problem? Because, in contrast to the rest of the body in the circulation, stem cells do not migrate spontaneously in the brain. You inject them and they just stay where they are, stay where you put them. So Jean's project is a way to fix that, essentially by giving the cells a different identity at first, so that they do spontaneously migrate because they basically behave like a type of glial cell, and then we what's called transdifferentiate them into the precursors of the neurons that we actually want to replace.
Sounds fascinating, and I think I should invite Jean to speak at a future London Futurist event.
I'm sure he would love to.
A question from Roman Bauer, who is an academic at a UK university, and he's wondering about the process for dispersing some of the funds from the SENS Foundation. So is it mainly to US universities, or is there a proportion that's possible to go to UK universities? And related, do you fund cryopreservation related research? He also asks.
Yeah, sure. So to the first question, yes, absolutely. We have a couple of projects in the UK right now, and we are wide open to doing that. In fact, the UK is a particularly interesting case because I'm from the UK originally, and when my mother died 10 years ago, and I donated most of my inheritance to the foundation, I, of course, wanted to do it tax efficiently. And in order to do that, we had to create a British foundation, which is a UK charity, because, of course, Sense Research Foundation is a US charity. And that foundation still exists, and, of course, receives donations all the time. In fact, it's part of the airdrop right now. You can, yes, and for those of you who are listening and thinking about the airdrop, there's one mistake that a few people have made in the past 48 hours. So let me say this loudly. If you are a British taxpayer and you want to donate to us, do not donate using the wallet IDs that you find on the SRF website, because those are for SRF donations, the US charity, and as things stand, we may be able to find some kind of workaround, but as things stand, it means you won't get your tax write-off. So make sure you contact us, and we will give you actual instructions for how to do this right. It involves a different wallet ID if you're in the UK. Where was I? Yes. So we definitely fund UK work, and because we have this tax situation there, with this it's independent charity that's a UK charity, it's actually easier for us to do that. Cryopreservation, absolutely. I have been a very strong supporter of cryonics for many, many years. Pleased to say that very prominent and high-profile gerontology professor in the UK, originally Portuguese, his name is João Pedro de Magalhães, Liverpool University. He also has been quite vocal in the past few years in support of cryonics research. We ourselves right now are funding a project at a company called 21st Century Medicine in Southern California. We're not funding it for profit, we're funding it as if they were a charity, really. And it is to take forward what I believe to be the single most promising technology to improve the quality of cryopreservation. In other words, to reduce the amount of damage done to the body by the cryopreservation process.
Let's take a question from Toby Unwin, who asks about regulation. Is this something that's holding back research? And he refers to Sir Richard Branson going to space last week. And Toby says that it took him 15 years after his initial space flight, and the delay in his case was not technological, but regulatory and legal. And Toby worries that the fight to push through anti-aging technology will be tougher, and there'll be many financial incumbents to unseat. So if we have to wait another 15 years to implement the technology, a lot of people will die needlessly. Have you any thoughts about how to go through or around?
So I don't think Richard Branson would entirely agree that there were no technological obstacles to getting this done sooner. But of course, I take your point, Toby. Now, absolutely, this is very, very important. The good news is that it didn't take me to point out that it was very important. This has been a topic of very considerable concern for a long time, and the concern has borne fruit already. The most important thing that's happened in the US is the approval by the FDA of a clinical trial for metformin, called the TAME trial, T-A-M-E, against aging. Metformin, of course, has been approved for decades and decades against diabetes, but because of increasingly persuasive evidence that it might have an effect against age-related health conditions in general, there was a very keen. There were a lot of people very keen to see. But in order to do that, the FDA had to approve the conducting of the trial. There was another minor problem, which was that nobody's going to make any money out of metformin, which means it had to be funded by philanthropy, and that turned out to be non-trivial. But that's happened now. That funding is confirmed, and the trial's going to start this year. The regulatory problem, though, was the FDA. The FDA get a hell of a bad rap, and it's completely undeserved. They are not the bad guys. They are just implementing the public policy as best they can. They want to save lives just as much as all of us do. So what is the problem? The problem is the bloody gerontologists couldn't decide on a definition of aging that was sufficiently crisp to satisfy the rather fundamental requirement for a clinical trial of having an actual, binary endpoint. That you could actually say whether the damn things worked or not. Finally, there was enough recognition in the field that they fixed that. So the clinical endpoint for this trial is something that ticks the boxes. From the point of view of the experts, it is aging in all but name. But from the point of view of the FDA, it's binary. It's sufficiently crisp that it does the job. What is it? It's combinatorial. Essentially, there have been half a dozen different conditions, health conditions of late life, the obvious ones really, the most obvious ones, each of which was individually a perfectly valid and traditional clinical endpoint for a clinical trial. And the trick was to combine them and to say basically if the patient gets any of these conditions, how long, what age were they when they got them, how long did it take? Additionally, they did this extremely clever thing of incorporating something that really recognizes the crosstalk that exists between different types of damage accumulation in the body. So they basically said, we're also going to look at the interval between when you get the first health condition and when you get the second one, when you start to exhibit what they like to call comorbidities. And so I'm oversimplifying somewhat, but this is the essence of the thing. And here's the point. It changes the incentive structure completely. Because what you've got now is, as I said, no one's going to ever make any money out of metformin, and indeed, there's a lot of skepticism as to whether it's going to give significant benefits anyway. But if you're a big pharma company, now you can do a clinical trial for something that you've actually got IP protection for and that you might be able to make money out of. And all you need to do is copy and paste this clinical endpoint into your own trial, and you're done. I mean, you're not done, but you've solved the biggest barrier.
I wonder if I can ask you to comment on some things that Nur Barzilai, who is the thought leader for TAM, has said. Because you talked about today about receiving an 8-digit donation in support of longevity research. Nur Barzilai was talking about a forthcoming 10-digit donation. And about 6 months ago, he said this might be happening in 2 months' time. Should we be skeptical, or should we anticipate some even greater news in terms of high wealth individuals putting their money behind this project?
This is going to happen. It has been delayed several times, as you say. I believe that the schedule is now August, that this will be announced. I'm afraid that I am still sworn to secrecy, same as everybody else is, though, to be honest, within the expert community, it's a semi-open secret at this point. But yes, that is absolutely going to happen. There is actually a second thing that's going to happen, which I can say even less about. But I've been saying a little more than nothing about it recently. The second thing is going to be a private sector initiative, and it will be mostly bankrolled by someone that everybody on this call has heard of. I can't mention that person's name, but I can say, if you're listening, for God's sake, don't fuck it up the way Larry Ellison did 20 odd years ago and the way Larry Page did 8 years ago. You know exactly what I mean. Get it right.
Well, top-rated question in the Q&A currently is by PNJ. I think you've addressed some of this, but I'll give you a chance to offer more. Can you speculate on what might be the specific triggers of a change in public attitude?
Yes, I have the same view on this that I've had for 20 years. So let me spell it out. I believe it's all going to be about my colleagues, my fellow thought leaders in the field, of whom really there are no more than half a dozen. We're talking about David Sinclair, Brian Kennedy, Eric Verdin, Jay Olshansky, Nur Barzilai. There are not very many people we're talking about here. And at the moment, though David, as I mentioned earlier, is edging in the right direction, there is still a very great degree of hesitation and caution with regard to speculation about how much we're going to be able to do about aging and how soon. There is an absolute phobia among the gerontology top brass with regard to overpromising and underdelivering. And in my first conference that I ran in 2003 in Cambridge, I gave 2 talks, and one of them was about this. The title of the talk was something like Biogerontologists' Duty to Discuss Timeframes Publicly. And I made the case that this whole refusal to do that is costing lives, because yes, guesses are guesses. They're extremely subjective, but they're a hell of a lot more educated than the public's guesses. And if we don't do this, the public are going to carry on thinking that aging really is never going to be brought under control, and therefore they're not going to be very impressed by government spending taxpayers' money on trying to bring it under control a bit faster than it otherwise would be. So, bad news. And it's not even true that overpromising and under-delivering is a problem, because we've seen it. We saw it with the war on cancer, which is now 50 years ago, of course. It was 30 years ago then, where, the oncology community was very over-optimistic about bringing cancer under control, and they expressed their optimism, and Nixon noticed, and Nixon did something about it. He trebled the budget of the National Cancer Institute, if I remember rightly. And was progress anything like as rapid as people had expected? It was a tiny fraction. But it was a hell of a lot more than it would have been if the NCI budget had not been trebled. And the key point is there was no backlash. The NCI budget has continued to rise every year ever since. Once the public get the bit between their teeth, you're done. So, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that the centre of gravity of publicly stated expert opinion of my fellow thought leaders is going to move in the direction of basically saying, yes, Aubrey de Grey was right all along. Of course, I won't say it quite that way. And it only needs to edge a little way, I think, before the Oprah Winfreys of this world start to actually say something about this. I mean, the reason Oprah Winfrey got where she is today by paying close attention to the trends of publicly stated expert opinion. And, when Oprah Winfrey wants something done, it tends to happen. So, the following day it will become impossible to get elected unless you have a manifesto commitment to really have a proper war on aging. And the day after that, my job will be done, more or less.
So as a small step in that direction, there was the paper in Nature in the last week or so by Andrew Scott and David Sinclair and one other saying it's hugely cost effective to invest in addressing aging.
That's right, yeah. I mean, of course, the general message that aging is incredibly expensive, and if we can postpone it even a little bit, then we have astronomical economic savings. That's not a new message at all. It was touted under the banner, under the heading of the longevity dividend, long time ago, and in fact, even that wasn't original. So what's different now? What's different now is that Andrew, bless his heart, has actually listened enough to me to start talking not only about slowing aging down a bit, but about reversing aging. He calls it the Wolverine scenario in the paper, and he's only addressed it in a very superficial way in this first paper. There's massive more coming, but he and I worked quite closely to make sure that there was something about this there, and to get economists to start realizing that bona fide rejuvenation is not a pipe dream. It is actually something that proper experts in this space are talking about and are developing. So that's the key difference from the recent paper from Andrew.
It's 1:15, and I know you told me you've something else at 1/2, so we've only got a few more minutes of your time. I will take the top question on the list again. It's by Callum Chase. Do you anticipate a panic when the aging trance lifts? I mean, he refers to his conversation with people about aging, and most people are complacent about dying when they're roughly 80. But if this complacency is suddenly lifted, isn't there going to be a demand for aging to be tackled that's going to have more urgency, and there'll be all sorts of misinformation, blame, fear, and confusion?
Well, so honestly, yes, it's going to be absolute mayhem. And this is why I have been making such a big deal of talking about this anticipation phase over the past couple of years, because I have realized, and well, I knew already, I've realized that it's really important to tell people that we should be trying to anticipate that anticipation. Specifically, there are some people, some constituencies, some people who are in a position to make substantial difference to how turbulent that period is, just by having the right answers, the right policies, the right things to do as soon as the anticipation begins. But in other words, having thought it through beforehand. So this is the main theme of all the talks I give to the people in the financial services sector, who are responsible for things like insurance and pensions and inheritance arrangements and so on. These are the people who are going to need, not only for the profitability of their own business, but for society at large, they're going to need to have anticipated that anticipation before it hits in order to be able to respond to it promptly and appropriately. Of course, this is absolutely fundamentally true at the level of governments as well. I'm honestly not sure what's going to happen, especially if the anticipation hits in the next 5 days rather than the next 5 years.
Wow. And what's the feedback from these audiences when you talk to insurance people or people operating pension schemes? Are they in denial, or are they seriously engaging you? And is that changing?
Oh, they're definitely in denial, but perhaps slightly less so than they used to be. I mean, certainly the impression I used to have when I was talking this way 10 years ago would have been like, they're terribly courteous, but, you definitely have the impression that they're going to wake up the following day and it was all a bad dream and they get on as if nothing had happened. Now I think they're beginning to feel a little more uncomfortable about it. But yeah, I mean, it cannot be overstated. People moving, more or less overnight, most of the world moving from an attitude of thinking they're going to live just slightly longer than their parents did to an attitude of expecting these therapies probably will come along in time for them and therefore they will live massively, massively longer. That's going to make quite a difference to these big ticket items that determine the structure of the global economy.
Are you still getting feedback from, well, there's a question from Miguel Marcos Martinez, who puts into words some feedback that I sometimes hear, that we're messing with evolutionary diversity in the world if we are enhancing lifespans. Are there risks to people from an having an unclear ethical understanding of this project?
Yeah, I wish I could say that I am getting that kind of question less these days than I did 20 years ago, despite the fact that I have answered it 1,000 times. But no, I'm still getting it a lot. Yeah, I mean, of course, this is medical research. All I really need to do when people have concerns of this nature is to remind people that they don't say such things about Alzheimer's disease. That this is just health and that longevity is a side effect of health. There is, I think, everyone has this, not everyone, but far too many people still have this take that, like, there is a trade-off between quality of life and quantity of life, which, of course, these days, today, it's true. There are a lot of things we like doing that are bad for us. But these therapies are all about making the opposite true, making it a case that quality confers quantity. So, of course, there are no ethical issues. There are plenty of sociological issues. We've been discussing a lot of them already, how we will roll this out as quickly as possible. And, of course, I could go on until tomorrow talking about all of the various problems that people raise about, won't dictators live forever or won't it be boring and so on. But I won't, because I've done it before.
Well, in a minute, I'll give you a chance to make any final comments, things that you want people to bear in mind. I will very briefly just run through what's coming next on London Futurists. So today we've been looking at this topic. We are coming back to this topic in 5 weeks' time, when Sergey Young will be talking about themes from his forthcoming new book, The Science and Technology of Growing Young. And Sergey will bring a slightly different perspective because he has been overseeing various funds for many years, and he makes a point of figuring out, as he says, what actually works. I've been reading this book in the last week or so. It is giving me a lot to think about, things I didn't know about before. And Sergey will also offer practical advice on how people can look after their health and longevity in the short term until these technologies are more widely available. So that's in 5 weeks' time. In 2 weeks' time, we're doing something slightly different. We've got Natasha Vitamore talking about education. This is not education in longevity and biology, but education in some of the philosophies that go together with some of these viewpoints. So the future of transhumanist studies, that's from Natasha. And one last thing I'll mention is not a London Futurist event, it's by myself, where I am speaking at the US Transhumanist Party's Virtual Enlightenment Salon. I'm speaking at 1 p.m. tomorrow, that specific time, which is 9 p.m. British time. You can find details of that online. I'm going to be talking about why we should be thinking even harder about the future. So I'm going to be talking about what matters most, why technology is such a force for change, how wonderful the world could be, how badly things might go wrong if we mismanage them, and then advocacy of transhumanism, advocacy for transforming education, and advocacy for transforming parts of politics. So that's from me in tomorrow night. You can find the details online. Aubrey, you've been elucidating, you've been cogent and coherent despite not having too many minutes of sleep in the last 48 hours. Thank you so much for sharing some fascinating up-to-the-minute news. Is there any final thoughts you'd like people to have in mind?
Yes. And I'm going, first of all, to paste into the chat the link to the airdrop that I was talking about so breathlessly earlier on. This is the link to donate to Sense Research Foundation in return, though not contractually, I point out again, for Richard Hart, saying he's going to send you some of this new coin. One thing I want to say about it, for those of you who are crypto enthusiasts yourselves, this is quite important. I mentioned that Richard is a slightly polarizing influence in the field. Some people are a little unhappy with the way that Hex has been managed. And there is therefore the possibility that some people may be concerned about how he is doing the pulse chain. Specifically, pulse chain is going to be a hard fork of Ethereum. I honestly don't really know what that means, but there are probably some people here who do. And it was suggested to me that maybe this will not be to the liking of Vitalik Buterin, the guy who created Ethereum and who, of course, has also donated very extensively to Sense Research Foundation. So I want to reassure everybody here who has any idea of what this is all about that actually Vitalik has expressed directly to me his strong support for this and said that, you know, this whole thing has greatly improved his opinion of Richard Hart. So, yeah, please do not worry about that. The link that I've shown you there is, of course, to a page at Sense Research Foundation. It tells you everything you need to do in order to get involved in this. Therefore, I want to highlight two mistakes that certain people are making. And I don't want you to carry on making them. The first one I want to mention, I've already mentioned, is that if you are a UK taxpayer, you need different wallet IDs to donate to if you want to donate crypto than the ones on our website, which would go directly to Sense. If you use the ones on our website, you will not, as things stand, get a tax benefit. The second mistake that people are making is, turns out that you can get into this airdrop thing, this kind of promise to receive pulse chain, without donating to Sense. You can go to the page that Richard himself has set up for Pulse and donate there. And if you do that, yes, you'll get into the airdrop, but we won't get your money, and you won't get your tax write-off if you're a US taxpayer. So don't do that either. Finally, of course, I should mention TGE, Transnational Giving Europe. I see that there are plenty of people from Europe on this call. You can give to Sense tax efficiently if you are a European taxpayer, for most European countries anyway. And that is something that you can find out more about again on our website on the donate page. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I'll just draw people's attention to a Meet that Brian from Canada has set up. A Meet is a way to continue some of this discussion afterwards. I can't come today. I've got other things going, but if you look in the chat, you will see a link. I'll leave the chat running for another 10 minutes or so before I shut down the whole Zoom. But I'll let you go now, Aubrey, to give you a few nanoseconds of comfort time before you get involved in the next interview, podcast, or whatever. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David. And do tell me as soon as this is publicly viewable. Oh, it's been live on YouTube. Fantastic. So send me. I'm not very good at this kind of thing. You know that. So send me the YouTube link so that I can.
I'm going to slightly tidy it but within 24 hours there'll be a slightly edited version of this without the umming and erring at the beginning.
Yeah. No, I want it out there now.
Well, it is live already. Yes.
Okay. Just send me that link, please.
Excellent.
Rock and roll. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.